You're in the wrong seat. People don't just end up in first class. You need to check your ticket.
Ma'am, respectfully, I've checked my ticket. This is my assigned seat. It says 2A.
Venus let out a disbelieving laugh as she stared directly at Joshua.
You expect anyone to believe that? Look at you. You're either in the wrong cabin or using someone else's ticket. Captain, security, whoever, I want him removed before this flight leaves. I won't spend hours trapped next to him.
The cabin fell silent as passengers lifted their phones to record the confrontation.
I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be. I'll leave. But you're going to want to remember this seat, ma'am.
Venus thought she was removing an unwanted passenger. She had no idea she was removing the man who owned 51% of her company. Joshua Archer found his seat and sat down. Seat 2A, first class. He put his phone on airplane mode but kept the screen on. He wanted to look at his notes one more time before the flight took off. The notes were about a company called Halstead Beauty Group. Tonight, he had a big announcement to make there. But right now, he just looked like a tired man in a suit, scrolling through his phone before a long flight. He didn't look like a man who owned anything. That was exactly how he liked it. Other passengers walked past him down the aisle. Some glanced his way. Most didn't. He was used to that. He kept his eyes on his screen and let the cabin fill up around him. Then Venus Halstead stepped through the curtain into first class. She scanned the cabin the way she always did, like she was counting who deserved to be there. Her eyes landed on Joshua in 2A, and something in her face changed, tightened, like she'd found a stain on a clean shirt. She didn't check his boarding pass. She didn't ask a flight attendant. She just walked straight up to his row and stood over him. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was sharp enough to cut through the low hum of the cabin. "I think you're in the wrong section." Joshua looked up slowly. "I don't think so. This is first class." She said it like he might not know what the letters on the ticket meant. "Coach is that way." She pointed toward the curtain behind her, like she was shooing away a stray dog. "I'm aware," Joshua said. His voice stayed calm, flat. "I'm in my seat. I don't think you understand." Venus's voice climbed a notch. Heads turned. A woman 2 rows up lowered her magazine. "People don't just end up in first class. You need to check your ticket." "I have," Joshua said. "It says 2A." Venus let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind meant to be heard by everyone around them. "Right. Sure it does." A flight attendant hurried over, her smile stretched thin and nervous. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Venus snapped, before Joshua could speak. "There's clearly been some kind of mix-up. This man is sitting in my section, and frankly, it's making me very uncomfortable." The flight attendant looked at Joshua. "Sir, could I see your boarding pass?" Joshua reached into his jacket without a word and pulled it out. He held it up so both the attendant and Venus could see it. His name, Seat 2A, First Class, paid in full. The flight attendant's smile faltered. "This looks correct. That can't be right." Venus's arms crossed hard over her chest. Her cheeks had gone red, but not with embarrassment. With anger, the kind that comes from being questioned instead of obeyed. "Do you have any idea who I am? I fly this airline every single week. I have status. I have standing. And I am telling you, something is wrong here." "Ma'am, the ticket shows." "I don't care what the ticket shows." Venus's voice cracked across the cabin now, loud enough that no one pretended not to listen anymore. Phones started to rise, quietly, from laps and pockets. "I want him moved. Now. Or I want a manager. This is my airline. This is my seat. And I will not sit here and be made uncomfortable for one more second." The flight attendant's eyes flicked to Joshua, apologetic and helpless all at once. "Sir, I'm so sorry, but I'm going to need to get someone to look into this." A gate officer boarded a few minutes later, radio crackling on his shoulder. He looked between Venus and Joshua, then down at the boarding pass, still in Joshua's hand. "Sir, this ticket looks valid to me," the officer said. "It doesn't matter what it looks like," Venus cut in. "I want him off this plane." The officer kept his eyes on Joshua. "I'm sorry about this. I just need you to step off with me so we can sort it out on the ground." "I understand," Joshua said. "I'm not going to make this harder than it needs to be." "Appreciate that," the officer said quietly, almost like an apology of his own. Joshua didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded once, like he'd expected exactly this. He rose from his seat, aware of every phone pointed his way. Every whispered word passed between strangers who had no idea what they were watching. As he passed Venus's row, he stopped, just for a second, long enough to look her straight in the eye. "You're going to want to remember this seat, Ms. Halstead." Venus blinked, thrown off by the sound of her own name in his mouth. But before she could ask how he knew it, Joshua was already walking down the aisle, calm as the moment he'd sat down, the officer close behind him. Venus settled into her seat with a satisfied huff, smoothing her blouse like she'd just won something. She had no idea what she'd actually lost. The jet bridge felt colder than the cabin. Joshua walked down it with the officer a half-step behind him, his bag slung over one shoulder, his face unreadable. Behind him, through the small round window in the door, he could still hear the low murmur of first class settling back into its comfortable hum, like nothing had happened at all, like a man hadn't just been pulled off a plane he'd paid to be on. The officer cleared his throat once they reached the gate area. "Sir, I want to be straight with you. I looked at that ticket. It was valid. I don't know what that was back there." Joshua set his bag down by his feet. "I do." The officer raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. "You want to file a complaint? I can get you the airline's incident report line. Get this on record." "Not yet," Joshua said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it now. Steady, controlled, like a man who already knew exactly how this story was going to end. "Trust me, there's a better way to handle this." The officer studied him a second longer, like he was trying to figure out what kind of man says something like that after getting thrown off a plane in front of 40 strangers. He didn't press further. "All right. Well, for what it's worth, that shouldn't have happened to you. It happens more than people think," Joshua said quietly. He wasn't angry. That was the strange part, even to himself. He'd felt anger plenty of times in his life. In boardrooms, in banks, in rooms where men in expensive suits looked right through him like he was invisible. But this wasn't anger. This was something colder, something patient. He thought about Venus Halstead's face, the way she hadn't even glanced at his boarding pass before deciding he didn't belong, the way she'd said, "I don't care what the ticket shows," like the truth was beneath her. She hadn't even really been looking at him. She'd been looking at what she assumed he was. She had no idea what he actually was. Joshua pulled out his phone the moment the officer stepped away, thumb moving fast over the screen. He didn't call the airline. He called Nancy. She picked up on the second ring. "Please tell me you're not calling from baggage claim." "I'm calling from the gate," Joshua said. "I got pulled off the flight." There was a pause. "Pulled off? What happened?" "A woman decided I didn't belong in first class. Made a scene, got the flight attendant, then an officer. Didn't matter that I had a valid ticket. She just wanted me gone." Nancy's voice sharpened, the way it always did when something crossed from annoying into unacceptable. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Joshua said, and he meant it. "But you're going to want to hear her name." "Go on." "Venus Halstead." There was a longer pause this time. Joshua could practically hear Nancy doing the math on the other end. The gala tonight, the announcement, the paperwork they'd both spent 3 months keeping quiet. "You're joking," Nancy finally said. I wish I was. She had you removed, off a plane, today, hours before. Yeah. Nancy exhaled hard, and for a second neither of them said anything. Then, in a voice that had gone flat and businesslike, the sound of a woman already moving into action, she said, "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. We are not missing this gala tonight." "I wasn't planning on it," Joshua said. He hung up and looked out through the terminal window at the tarmac, at his old flight already backing away from the gate, carrying Venus Halstead toward a city where, in a few short hours, she was going to learn exactly who she'd just humiliated in front of a plane full of witnesses. He wasn't going to storm into that gala and announce it in anger. He wasn't going to raise his voice, point a finger, or demand an apology. He didn't need to. All he had to do was walk in, take the stage, and let the truth do what humiliation alone never could. He picked his bag back up off the floor and headed for the exit doors, calm as ever, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way he always did. Nancy DeLeo was already waiting at the curb when Joshua pushed through the terminal doors, her car idling in the loading zone with its hazard lights blinking. She leaned across and pushed the passenger door open before he even reached it. "Get in," he said. "Tell me everything on the way." "Wait, she said it." Joshua slid into the seat and shut the door. Nancy pulled out into traffic fast, the kind of driving that said she'd already decided they didn't have time to waste. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Every detail." So he did. He told her about sitting down in 2A, about Venus walking through the curtain and looking at him like he was something spilled on the carpet. He told her about the boarding pass, about the flight attendant's nervous smile, about Venus's voice climbing louder and louder until half the cabin was watching. He told her what Venus said, "I don't care what the ticket shows," and Nancy's knuckles went a little whiter on the wheel. "She didn't even check your ticket first," Nancy said. "It wasn't a question. Not once." "Of course she didn't." Nancy shook her head, eyes on the road. "That's not how people like her operate. They don't check. They just decide. And then they expect the world to rearrange itself around what they've decided." "Remind me why I let you talk me into flying commercial for this," Joshua muttered, half to himself. "I own a company that owns a jet." "Because that was the whole point," Nancy said. "You wanted to walk into Halstead Beauty Group as a stranger, not as a headline. If Ridgeline's plane lands at a private terminal 3 hours before your own acquisition announcement, someone snaps a photo, and the surprise is gone before you've said a word. Flying commercial, sitting in a regular seat, showing up like anybody else. That was your idea, not mine. You wanted to see how this company treats people who don't look like money." Joshua exhaled, some of the tension easing out of his shoulders. "Well, I got my answer." "You got more than an answer," Nancy said. "You got proof." Joshua looked out the window at the city sliding past, still turning the whole thing over in his mind. "She's going to be at the gala tonight." "She's the host of the gala tonight," Nancy said. "Or she thinks she is." That settled between them for a moment, heavy and satisfying all at once. Nancy merged onto the highway, checking the dashboard clock. "We're cutting it close. The board wants to make the announcement right at the top of the evening, before the shareholders get too deep into their champagne." "Good," Joshua said. "I don't want to give her time to relax." Nancy glanced sideways at him. "You know this changes everything, right? The moment you walk into that room, there's no going back to being quiet about this. 3 months of keeping Ridgeline's stake under wraps, gone in one announcement." "I know. You built this whole plan around watching Halstead Beauty Group from the ground up before anyone knew who you were. Sitting in meetings nobody thought mattered. Reading reports nobody thought you'd actually read." Nancy's voice had an edge of disbelief in it now, like she still couldn't quite believe the timing. "And the one time you finally step into the light, It's because the CEO had you thrown off a plane. Some things you can't plan for, Joshua said. Nancy almost laughed, but it came out tighter than that, more like disbelief chased by anger. 51%, Joshua. You own more of that company than her whole family combined, and she just had you dragged off in front of 40 strangers because she didn't like the way you looked sitting in her section. Joshua didn't answer right away. He was thinking about the phrase Nancy had used weeks ago, back when they were still finalizing the paperwork on the acquisition, something about the company's bylaws that had barely registered with him at the time. Remind me of something, he said. That supermajority rule. The 2/3 thing you mentioned for board actions. Nancy glanced at him, surprised by the sudden shift. Any major action, bylaw changes, removing a board member, restructuring control, needs 2/3 of the board to approve it, not just a simple majority. It's an old rule, written in when the company first went public, so no single-family faction could push through a decision on a slim vote. Good to know, Joshua said. Nancy frowned slightly, but let it go, focused instead on the road, on the clock, on the gala waiting for them across the city. We're going to make it, she said, more to herself than to him. We're going to walk into that ballroom, and she is going to have absolutely no idea what's about to happen to her. Joshua looked ahead, at the skyline rising up in the windshield, city lights blinking on as the sun dropped low behind the buildings. No, he said quietly. She really isn't. The ballroom glittered with the kind of light that only old money knew how to buy. Chandeliers threw gold across the tables. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. At the front of the room, a banner read, Halstead Beauty Group, 40 years of legacy, in soft, elegant script. Venus Halstead moved through the room like she owned every square inch of it. Because, as far as she knew, she did. She had already put the plane behind her. That was the thing about Venus. Inconveniences didn't stick to her. Some man got removed from a flight. Fine, unfortunate, but not her problem anymore. Tonight was about her company, her family's name, her moment. She stepped up to the small stage near the head table and tapped her glass with a spoon until the room quieted. Thank you all for being here, she said, her voice smooth and practiced, the voice of a woman who had given this exact kind of speech 100 times before. 40 years ago, my grandfather built this company out of nothing but ambition and a good eye for what women deserved to feel like when they looked in the mirror. Tonight, I want to raise a glass to another year of Halstead family leadership. Steady hands, steady values, and a legacy that isn't going anywhere. Glasses lifted around the room. Applause rippled through the tables. Then the outgoing board chair stepped up beside her, and something in his face made Venus's smile falter, just slightly. Before we continue with the evening, he said into the microphone, the board has an important announcement to make, one that affects the future of this company significantly. Venus's champagne glass stayed frozen halfway to her lips. The chair gestured toward the side of the stage. Please welcome the new majority shareholder of Halstead Beauty Group and the company's incoming chairman of the board. Joshua Archer walked out from the wings. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence itself did all the talking, a heavy, total stillness that swept table to table as recognition dawned across the crowd. Venus's champagne glass lowered on its own, her hand no longer steady enough to hold it up. It was him, the man from the plane, the man she'd had removed from first class hours earlier, right in front of a cabin full of witnesses. Joshua reached the microphone and looked out over the room, calm as still water. Good evening, he said. For those who don't know me, my name is Joshua Archer. I'm the founder of Ridgeline Capital. He let that settle a moment before continuing. 3 months ago, Ridgeline Capital completed the acquisition of a 51% stake in Halstead Beauty Group. A murmur rolled through the crowd, quiet but electric. I chose to keep that quiet, Joshua continued, because I wanted to understand this company the way it actually operates, not the way it presents itself in press releases and galas. I wanted to see it from the ground up. His eyes moved briefly, deliberately, toward Venus. I got exactly the education I was looking for. Venus's face had drained of all its color. Her jaw worked, but nothing came out. As of tonight, Joshua said, I hold majority ownership of this company, and I've accepted the board's invitation to serve as chairman. He paused, letting the weight of it land fully across the room. I look forward to getting to know how this company is really run. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply stepped back from the microphone and let the moment breathe, the way a man does when he already knows he doesn't need to say another word. The room erupted into a storm of whispers, phones rising into the air, camera flashes catching Joshua's calm expression from every angle. Somewhere near the back, a reporter was already typing furiously into her phone. Venus stood frozen at the edge of the stage, her toast still hanging unfinished in the air, her family's name suddenly meaning far less in that room than it had 5 minutes earlier. Joshua stepped down from the podium without another glance her way, disappearing into the crowd of stunned shareholders and board members, leaving Venus standing exactly where she'd been standing all along. Except now, everyone in the room understood something she was only just beginning to grasp. She hadn't just embarrassed a stranger on a plane. She had just spent the last several hours humiliating the man who now owned her entire life's work. Venus didn't remember walking off the stage. One moment she was standing at the podium with her toast dying in her throat, and the next she was in the hallway, just outside the ballroom, her heels clicking hard against the marble, her hand shaking around a glass of champagne she no longer wanted. Preston Mason caught up to her by the coat check, his phone already buzzing in his pocket, his face pulled tight with a calm that looked forced. Venus! He kept his voice low, glancing back toward the ballroom doors. Venus! Look at me! How? Her voice cracked on the single word. How is that man standing on my stage, Preston? How does Joshua Archer own 51% of my company? I don't know yet. I'm finding out. Find out faster. She set the champagne glass down hard on the coat check counter, her hand still trembling. Do you understand what just happened in there? Every board member, every major shareholder, every reporter in that room just watched him announce that he owns my family's company. My grandfather's company. Maison reached out and gently gripped her arm, steering her a few steps further from the ballroom doors, away from anyone who might overhear. Venus, I need you to hear me. This isn't about the announcement. Then what is it about? Maison lowered his voice even further. That man. Joshua Archer. Do you know where he was 6 hours ago? Venus blinked, thrown by the question. What are you talking about? He was on a plane, Maison said. The plane you were on. The one you had him removed from. The color that had already drained from Venus's face somehow drained further. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. You didn't just embarrass some passenger today, Maison said, quiet and flat. You had security remove the majority owner of your company from a first-class cabin in front of dozens of witnesses, hours before he walked into that ballroom and announced it to your entire board. You didn't just embarrass a stranger, Venus. You humiliated the most powerful man in this company, publicly. On camera, probably, knowing how many phones were out. I didn't know who he was, Venus said, her voice climbing, defensive now. How was I supposed to know? It doesn't matter if you knew, Maison said. It matters what he knows now. It matters what the board thinks when this story gets out. It matters what happens to this company, to your position in it. If the man who just took majority control decides he wants payback for how you treated him. Venus pressed a hand to her forehead, her carefully composed evening unraveling thread by thread. We fix this. We fix this right now, Preston. Tonight. I want an apology drafted. I want— No. Maison's voice was firm enough to stop her cold. No apology. Not yet. Not until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. Then what do we do? Maison glanced back toward the ballroom one more time, where the murmur of the crowd was still audible even through the closed doors, still buzzing with the shock of what they'd just witnessed. When he looked back at Venus, something in his expression had settled into something colder, more calculating. You let me handle this, he said. This is exactly what I'm here for. Handle it how? There's more at stake here than your pride, Venus. The words came out fast, almost slipping past him before he caught them. He recovered quickly, smoothing his tone back into something reassuring. I mean, there's the company's stability. The shareholders. If this turns into a public fight between you and Archer, it could destabilize everything your grandfather built. I'm not going to let that happen. Venus searched his face, too rattled to notice the flicker of something else behind his eyes, something that had nothing to do with protecting her family's legacy, and everything to do with protecting himself. How can you possibly undo what just happened in there? Maison allowed himself the smallest, calmest smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. You let me worry about the paperwork, he said. That's what I'm for. Venus wanted to press him further, wanted specifics, a plan, something solid to hold on to. But exhaustion and humiliation were pulling at her now, and Maison's confidence, however hollow it might have been, was the only steady thing in the room. Fine, she said finally, quietly. Fix it. I will, Maison said. By morning, you'll have options. He turned and walked back toward the ballroom, already pulling his phone from his pocket, already dialing someone Venus didn't recognize. She stood alone in the hallway a moment longer, staring at the closed doors behind which her entire company had just changed hands, with no idea that the man she'd just trusted to fix everything was about to make things far, far worse. Morning light cut through the blinds of Preston Maison's office, striping the carpet in thin gold lines. Venus sat across from his desk, a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, dark circles under her eyes from a night she'd spent mostly awake, replaying the ballroom over and over in her mind. Tell me you have something, she said. Maison slid a folder across the desk toward her. I have something better than something. Venus opened it. Inside was a printout, a short profile on a man named Walker Gallen, 78 years old, the previous minority shareholder of Halstead Beauty Group. Attached to it was a summary of the stock sale, dated 3 months earlier, transferring his shares to Ridgeline Capital. He sold fast, Maison said, tapping the page. Look at the timeline. Gallen held that stake for over a decade, barely touched it. And then suddenly, in the space of 3 weeks, he sells the entire thing to a fund most people have never heard of. Venus scanned the numbers, something sharpening behind her tired eyes. 3 weeks. Elderly man. No family involved in the negotiation, as far as I can tell. No outside counsel of his own, beyond what Ridgeline provided. Maison leaned back in his chair, watching her put the pieces together herself, the way he always preferred. You don't have to prove anything happened, Venus. You just have to ask the right questions loudly enough. Venus closed the folder slowly, a plan already forming behind her expression. A predatory fund. Pressured an old man into selling off decades of family investment in a matter of weeks. Used the sale to seize control of a company he clearly didn't understand he was handing over? There's your headline, Maison said quietly. And it doesn't matter if it's exactly true, Venus said, almost to herself. It just has to be believable enough to make people ask questions about him instead of me. By that afternoon, Venus was seated across from a business journalist she'd worked with before, someone who owed her family more than one favor over the years. The cameras weren't rolling. This was a print interview, quiet and careful, exactly the kind of soft launch a story like this needed. "I want to be honest with you," Venus said, her voice carefully wounded, careful and measured. "What happened at the gala was shocking to me too. I had no idea Joshua Archer was connected to Ridgeline Capital until he stood on that stage. But since then, my team has been looking into how exactly this acquisition happened. And frankly, what we've found is deeply troubling." The journalist leaned forward. "Troubling how?" "The man Ridgeline bought this stake from was 78 years old," Venus said. "He sold his entire stake in a company his family had been connected to for over a decade, in a matter of weeks, without any outside representation. I'm not accusing anyone of anything outright, but I think shareholders deserve to know how this deal was actually made." The story ran the next morning under a headline that did exactly what Venus wanted it to do: Raider or Rescuer? Questions swirl around sudden takeover of family beauty empire. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 other outlets. By evening, it was trending across social media, comment sections filling with strangers debating whether Joshua Archer had exploited a vulnerable old man to steal control of a beloved company. Footage from the plane was still circulating too. Grainy phone videos of Venus's voice rising in the cabin, of Joshua calmly showing his boarding pass, but it was getting buried now, pushed further down people's feeds beneath the new, uglier story Venus had planted. Venus watched the numbers climb from her office that evening, a small, tight smile finally returning to her face for the first time since the gala. It wasn't a full victory, but it was something. A foothold. A way to make the world doubt the man who had humiliated her, instead of only doubting her. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Nancy Dalio's name flashed across the screen. Not calling her, but a headline alert. Someone had forwarded the article directly into her assistant's inbox with a single line attached. "This is spreading fast." Across the city, in Ridgeline's offices, Nancy read the article twice, her jaw tightening more with each paragraph. She didn't wait. She picked up her phone and dialed Joshua immediately, already pacing toward the window, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He answered on the first ring. "We have a problem," Nancy said, "and her name is in the headline." Joshua read the article twice before he said anything at all. He sat across from Nancy at the small conference table in Ridgeline's office, the printed pages spread out between them, Venus's carefully wounded quotes underlined in red, where Nancy had marked them the night before. "She's smart," Joshua said finally. "I'll give her that." "She's not smart," Nancy said. "She's desperate. There's a difference. Smart people build something true. She built something that just sounds true, which means it falls apart the second we put the real story next to it. Then, let's put the real story next to it." Nancy was already reaching for her phone. "I have Walker Gallen's contact information from the acquisition paperwork. If he's willing to go on camera, this ends fast." It took most of the next morning to reach him, and another hour to convince him to come in person rather than speak over the phone. But by early afternoon, Walker Gallen sat in Ridgeline's small media room across from a single camera, sharp-eyed and irritated on Joshua's behalf, in a way that surprised even Joshua. "People are saying I got pressured," Walker said, before the reporter even finished her first question. "Pressured? At 78 years old? Like I don't know my own mind." The reporter, a young woman Nancy had personally vetted for fairness, leaned forward. "Can you walk us through how the sale actually happened, Mr. Gallen?" "I'll do better than that." Walker reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. worn soft at the creases like it had been carried around for years. "This is a letter my old friend wrote me. Venus's father. Man built half this company with my own investment money, and long before he passed, he told me plain, if I ever wanted to step back, sell clean, sell smart, don't wait until I was too old to enjoy the money." He held the letter up toward the camera, not close enough to read every word, but close enough that the handwriting was unmistakably real. "When Ridgeline came to me with a fair offer," Walker continued, "I didn't need 3 weeks to think it over because I'd been thinking it over for 3 years. Nobody pressured me into anything. I finally did what my old friend told me to do a long time ago." The reporter glanced toward Joshua, standing just off camera. "And Joshua Archer, the acquisition itself. How would you describe the negotiation?" "Respectful," Walker said flatly. "More respectful than most of the calls I get from my own family, frankly. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. That's more than I can say for the woman who's out there right now telling the world I got taken advantage of." The footage went live within the hour, cut down to a tight 3-minute segment that opened with Walker's handwriting held up to the camera and closed with his flat, irritated dismissal of Venus's story. It spread even faster than her article had. By evening, the online conversation had flipped hard. Comment sections that had been debating whether Joshua was a predator were now filled with fury directed at Venus instead. Headlines shifting from raider or rescuer to Halstead CEO's claims fall apart as seller speaks out. Joshua watched it happen from his office, arms crossed, no real satisfaction on his face. Just quiet confirmation. "She's going to come back harder," he said. "Probably," Nancy agreed. "People like her don't retreat. They regroup." Across town, inside Halstead Beauty Group's headquarters, most of the building had already gone dark for the night. But in the finance department, Senior Controller Donald Olivar sat alone at his desk, the glow of his monitor the only light in the room. Walker Gallen's interview still paused on a browser tab beside a set of vendor account spreadsheets he'd been quietly uneasy about for almost a year. He'd watched the whole news cycle unfold with a strange, sinking feeling in his stomach. Not about Joshua Archer, and not really about Venus either. About Preston Mason. About the name that kept appearing again and again at the bottom of vendor authorizations tied to accounts that didn't seem to do any real business at all. Donald glanced toward the hallway, empty and quiet, then pulled the spreadsheets closer and began to dig. The finance floor was silent, except for the hum of the servers in the back room and the soft click of Donald Olivar's keyboard. He'd been staring at these accounts for almost a year, ever since a routine audit had turned up a handful of vendor payments that didn't sit right with him. Small amounts at first, easy to explain away. A consulting fee here, a logistics contract there. But the amounts had grown steadily over the months, and every single one of them traced back to the same signature at the bottom of the authorization forms. Preston Mason. Donald pulled up the vendor list again, cross-referencing it against the company's registered business database. 3 of the 5 vendors didn't exist. Not really. No active business licenses, no verifiable addresses, nothing but shell names attached to bank accounts that received wire transfers every quarter. Right around the same time the company's pension fund made its regular disbursements. His stomach turned as the pattern clicked into place. The vendor payments weren't separate from the pension fund. They were routed through it. Small percentages skimmed off disbursements meant for retired employees, dressed up as consulting fees and logistics costs, funneled into accounts that led nowhere real. Donald sat back in his chair, his hand pressed against his mouth, running the numbers again in his head just to be sure he wasn't imagining the scale of it. Conservative estimate, just from what he could see on this screen alone. This had been going on for at least 4 years, maybe longer. He needed proof, not suspicion, Not a hunch he could carry into a room and get laughed out of. He needed documents he could put in front of someone who could actually do something about it. He opened a secure drive and began copying files, payment records, wire transfer confirmations, the original authorization forms with Maison's signature scrawled across the bottom of each one. His hands moved fast, methodical, years of careful habit taking over where nerves threatened to slow him down. He was halfway through copying the fourth file when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Donald froze. The footsteps grew louder, unhurried, moving toward the finance department from the direction of the executive offices. He glanced at the clock in the corner of his screen. Well past 10 at night. Nobody should have been on this floor. He minimized the file window fast, pulling up a routine budget spreadsheet in its place, his heart hammering against his ribs as the footsteps stopped just outside the department entrance. The door opened. It was Maison's assistant, a young woman named Cassandra who worked late more nights than not. A stack of folders balanced against her hip. She blinked in surprise at finding someone else on the floor. "Oh, Donald. Didn't know anyone else was still here." "Just finishing up some month-end numbers," Donald said, forcing his voice to stay level, casual, the same tone he used every single day of his ordinary, unremarkable career. "You know how it is this time of quarter." "Tell me about it." Cassandra gave a tired smile and moved past him toward the copy room, disappearing behind another door. Donald didn't move for a long moment. He just sat there, listening to the copier hum to life down the hall, his pulse slowly settling back into something normal. When he was sure she wasn't coming back through, he finished copying the last file, saved everything onto a small encrypted drive, and shut the spreadsheet down completely. He didn't try to access the archive again that night. He couldn't risk it, not with Cassandra still in the building, not with how close he'd just come to being caught with financial records that had nothing to do with month-end numbers. He walked out of the building 15 minutes later, drive tucked deep in his jacket pocket, glancing over his shoulder more than once on his way to the parking garage. At home, sitting at his kitchen table with the drive plugged into his personal laptop, he opened a blank email and stared at the cursor for a long time. To Joshua Archer, Ridgeline Capital. He typed 3 sentences explaining what he'd found. Attached nothing yet. Cautious even now. Then he read it over, hesitated, and deleted the whole thing. Not tonight. He needed to be sure Joshua was someone who would actually do the right thing with this, not just someone looking to win a fight with Venus Halstead. He closed the laptop, telling himself he'd decide by morning. The boardroom at Halstead Beauty Group felt colder than usual that morning. The long glass table lined on both sides with faces that had learned to read tension before a single word was spoken. Preston Mason stood at the head of the table, a folder open in front of him, his tie straightened with a little too much precision. He'd called this emergency session himself, using a provision in his role as general counsel that let him summon the board on short notice when material concerns arose about company governance. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Maison began, his voice smooth, practiced. "I want to raise a matter that I believe requires immediate board attention. The acquisition process behind Ridgeline Capital's recent purchase of a controlling stake in this company." Joshua sat near the far end of the table, Nancy beside him with a folder of her own, already open, already flagged with color-coded tabs. He didn't react to Maison's opening. He simply watched, patient, waiting to see exactly what angle Maison intended to attack from. "Our review has identified several procedural irregularities," Maison continued, sliding printed pages toward each board member. "Disclosure timing that may not meet regulatory standards. Valuation methods that appear inconsistent with the company's own historical benchmarks. Frankly, Enough concerns that I believe this board has a duty to formally review whether this acquisition should stand as executed. A murmur passed around the table. Hannah Varner, seated near the middle, didn't touch the papers in front of her. She simply watched Maison with the flat, unimpressed expression of someone who had sat through this exact kind of theater before. Nancy stood before Maison, had even finished settling back into his chair. I'd like to address each of these points directly, if the board doesn't mind. She moved through Maison's objections one by one, calm and precise, pulling documentation from her folder to counter every claim. The disclosure timing matched exactly what regulatory filings required. She had the filed dates to prove it. The valuation method matched 3 prior acquisitions the company itself had used in the past decade, with the paperwork to show it. By the time she finished, Maison's irregularities looked less like genuine concerns and more like a list assembled in a hurry by someone hoping nobody would check the math. With respect, Nancy finished, this acquisition was executed cleanly, transparently, and entirely within regulatory and company guidelines. I'd encourage the board to ask itself why these concerns are only being raised now, 2 days after Mr. Archer's ownership was formally announced. Silence settled over the table. Hannah Varner finally spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the quiet. I have a question for Mr. Mason. She didn't wait for permission. Why wasn't any of this reviewed before the acquisition closed? You're the company's general counsel. Due diligence on a deal like this would have crossed your desk months ago. Maison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We're still gathering the full picture, Ms. Varner. That's not an answer. Varner turned toward Joshua for the first time that morning, studying him with the same directness she'd just used on Maison. Mr. Archer, I'd like to hear directly from you why you kept this acquisition quiet for 3 months. Joshua met her eyes without hesitation. Because I wanted to understand this company from the inside, not from a press release. I wanted to know how it actually treats the people who work for it and buy from it, before I stepped into a boardroom and started making decisions about its future. And what did you learn? Joshua didn't flinch. More than I expected to. Varner held his gaze a moment longer, something shifting behind her expression. Not quite warmth, but respect. The kind earned rather than assumed. She looked back toward the table. I move that the board reject this review and formally uphold the acquisition as executed, she said. The vote came quickly after that. 6 in favor, 5 against. Maison's carefully assembled objections collapsing under the weight of Nancy's documentation and Varner's refusal to let vague suspicion pass as fact. Maison gathered his folder without a word, his composure cracking just slightly at the edges as he excused himself from the room early, already dialing someone before he'd even reached the door. As the room emptied, Hannah Varner lingered near Joshua's seat. I don't back people because of their name, she said quietly. I've spent too many years watching this board do exactly that. I'll back whoever actually shows me the real books. I intend to, Joshua said. Varner nodded once, like she was filing that promise away for later, and walked out, leaving Joshua and Nancy alone in a boardroom that, for the first time since the gala, felt like it might actually belong to them. 2 days after the board vote, Joshua's phone buzzed with an email from an address he didn't recognize. No subject line, just a short message. I have information about Preston Mason you need to see. Can we meet somewhere away from the office? D. Oliver, Senior Controller, Halstead Beauty Group. Joshua showed it to Nancy within the hour. She read it twice, her expression sharpening the way it always did when something felt real instead of noisy. Senior Controller, she said. That's not a title people throw around lightly when they're trying to cause trouble. That's someone with actual access to the books. Set it up, Joshua said. Somewhere quiet. They met Donald Olivar 2 evenings later at a small coffee shop several blocks from Halstead's headquarters, a place with no company logos on the walls, and few enough customers that a quiet conversation wouldn't draw attention. Donald arrived first, a worn leather bag on the seat beside him, his hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. He clearly wasn't drinking. He didn't waste time on pleasantries once Joshua and Nancy sat down. "I've worked at Halstead Beauty Group for 11 years, Donald said, keeping his voice low. "I've watched a lot of things happen in that building that I told myself weren't my business. This isn't one of them." He slid a folder across the table, the same documents he'd copied that night on the finance floor, printed now and organized into a clear timeline. Joshua opened it slowly. Wire transfers, shell vendor names, authorization forms, all bearing the same signature at the bottom. "Preston Mason has been skimming from the company's pension fund for at least 4 years, Donald said. "Small percentages, dressed up as consulting fees and logistics costs, routed through vendors that don't actually exist. It adds up to a significant amount of money that should belong to retired employees who worked for this company their entire careers." Joshua flipped through the pages slowly, his jaw tightening with each new document. "And Venus?" Donald hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Her signature is on some of the higher-level authorizations, but I don't think she read what she was signing. I've watched her operate for years. She trusts Maison completely, signs what he puts in front of her without asking many questions. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth, as far as I can tell." Nancy leaned forward. "You're saying she's negligent, not necessarily complicit." "I'm saying I don't know what's in her head," Donald said. "I only know what's on paper, and what's on paper is bad enough on its own." Joshua sat back, the folder still open in front of him, quiet for a long moment. What was on those pages reframed everything that had happened over the past week. The plane, the smear campaign, the emergency board session. It wasn't just one woman's cruelty on a single bad day. It was a company culture that had spent years looking away from what Maison had been quietly building underneath all of them, protected by a family name that assumed loyalty meant never asking hard questions. "She still had me thrown off that plane," Joshua said finally, more to himself than to Donald. "She still ran that story about Gallon to the press, knowing it probably wasn't true. Whatever she didn't know about Maison, she knew exactly what she was doing to me." "I'm not asking you to forgive her," Donald said. "I'm asking you to stop what Maison has been doing to people who can't afford to lose what he's been taking from them." Joshua closed the folder. "We will." Nancy was already thinking 3 steps ahead, the way she always did. "This needs to go to someone on the board who'll actually act on it, not just sit on it. Someone with credibility the rest of them will listen to." "Hannah Varner," Joshua said. Donald looked between them, some of the tension finally easing from his shoulders now that the information wasn't his alone to carry. "She's the only one on that board who's ever asked me a real question about the numbers, instead of just nodding along with whatever Maison presents." "Then that's where we start," Joshua said. They spent the next hour going through the documents in careful detail, building a plan, Donald continuing to quietly gather what he could without drawing attention, Nancy preparing the legal framework to present formal allegations, Joshua mapping out exactly when and how to bring it in front of the full board. By the time they left the coffee shop that night, the plan was set. They'd bring the evidence to Varner first, build a united front, and take it to the shareholders at the next full meeting. None of them yet knew how little time they actually had before Maison made his next move. The week that followed moved fast and quiet. Donald continued pulling records from the finance archive whenever he could do it safely, careful never to access more than he needed in a single sitting, careful never to work late enough to cross paths with Cassandra again. Nancy built the legal framework for a formal fraud allegation, cross-referencing every wire transfer against pension disbursement dates until the pattern was airtight enough to survive any challenge Maison might throw at it. Hannah Varner met with them twice more, each time more convinced than the last. By the end of the week, she'd agreed to formally move, at the next full shareholder meeting, to strip both Maison and Venus of operational control. Maison for the fraud itself, Venus for years of signing off on what he'd been doing without ever asking the questions she should have. "We have the documentation," Varner told Joshua during their last meeting before the vote. "We have the timeline. We have someone on the inside willing to testify to it directly. This isn't a maybe anymore. This is decisive." It felt, for the first time since the gala, like the ground beneath them had finally gone solid. Then, the night before the scheduled shareholder meeting, everything shifted. Joshua was still at his office when Nancy called, her voice tight in a way he'd never heard from her before. "Maison just pushed through an emergency bylaw amendment," she said. "Tonight. A closed session, board members only, no advance notice to us." "What kind of amendment?" He dug up an old clause buried in the original Halstead Family Trust. Something about share dilution protections tied to founding family control. He used it to justify issuing a new block of shares, diluting every outside stakeholder's percentage, including yours. Nancy's voice was clipped, controlled anger barely held in check. "Your 51% just dropped to 49 on paper." Joshua went still. "That's enough to strip my voting control." "That's exactly what it's designed to do." Joshua closed his eyes for a moment, feeling something colder than anger settle into his chest. "And Venus backed it?" "Publicly," Nancy confirmed. "She stood right beside him in the session. She still thinks he's protecting her." By morning, the damage was official. Joshua's chairmanship was suspended pending review of the new share structure. Donald's system access was cut the same night. Locked out before he even reached his desk. A company-wide memo circulating about temporary security protocols that fooled no one who actually understood what had just happened. Joshua sat in Ridgeline's office that afternoon, the suspension notice printed and sitting on the table in front of him, feeling for the first time since the plane like the ground had genuinely dropped out from under him. Everything they'd built over the last 2 weeks, the board vote, Donald's evidence, Varner's support, all of it suddenly sitting on the wrong side of a locked door. "They planned this well," Nancy said quietly. Sitting across from him, the amendment paperwork spread out between them. "Maison isn't protecting Venus anymore. Not really. He's protecting himself. He knew the fraud allegations were coming, and he found a way to strip your control before we could bring them to the full shareholder vote." Joshua rubbed a hand across his jaw, running through every option, every angle, looking for something they'd missed. "Is there anything we can use? Anything in the trust language itself?" Nancy didn't answer right away. She was staring down at the amendment paperwork instead, flipping back through pages she'd already read twice, something catching her attention on the third pass. Her eyes narrowed. "Wait," she said, more to herself than to him. "What?" She flipped back another page, cross-referencing the vote tally recorded at the bottom of the emergency session, minutes against a section of the bylaws she knew practically by memory at this point. Her expression shifted, slow and careful, like she was almost afraid to trust what she was seeing. "Joshua," she said, looking up at him finally, something sharp and electric behind her eyes. "This bylaw amendment needed a 2/3 vote to pass legally. Major board actions always do. I told you that myself, the very first night, in the car on the way to the gala." Joshua felt something shift in his chest, the beginning of an idea forming before she'd even finished the thought. "Count the room again," Nancy said. "I don't think they had the votes." Nancy was at Ridgeline's office before 7 the next morning, 3 separate coffees already cold on her desk, The emergency session minutes spread out across every inch of available table space. Joshua arrived to find her exactly where he'd left her the night before, like she hadn't slept at all. "Tell me you found something," he said. "I found everything," Nancy said, sliding a single page toward him, a section circled twice in red ink. "Here, the official minutes from Maison's emergency session. 9 board members present, out of 11 total. That checks out. 2 were traveling." "Right. And of those 9, look at the actual recorded vote count." She tapped the page. 6 in favor of the amendment. 3 opposed. Joshua did the math quickly in his head. 6 out of 9. That's better than a simple majority. "It's not enough," Nancy said. "Not for this. I pulled the original bylaws again last night, word for word. The section covering major board actions, bylaw amendments, share restructuring, anything that changes the fundamental control of the company." She turned her laptop toward him, the document already open, the relevant clause highlighted. 2/3 of the full board. Not 2/3 of whoever happens to be in the room. 11 members total means they needed 8 votes to pass this legally. They only had 6. Joshua read the clause twice, feeling something steady and certain settle into his chest for the first time since the amendment had gone through. So the dilution was never actually legal. "It was never legal," Nancy confirmed. "Maison either didn't check the exact language closely enough, or he assumed nobody else would either. Either way, the moment we formally challenge this, it collapses. There's no ambiguity here. The bylaws are clear, and the vote count doesn't meet the threshold. How fast can you file the challenge?" "Today," Nancy said. "I want this in front of legal counsel and the board secretary before Maison has any chance to backfill the vote or find some other clause to hide behind." Joshua's phone rang before she'd even finished the sentence. Donald's name flashed on the screen, calling from a number Joshua didn't recognize. A personal phone, not his company line, which had been cut off 2 nights earlier. "Joshua." Donald's voice was quiet, careful, like he was speaking from somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. "I don't have much time. I wanted you to know something before they lock me out of everything completely." "Go ahead." 2 nights ago, right after I heard about the emergency session being called, I had a bad feeling about where this was heading. So I forwarded everything, the full pension fraud files, the wire transfers, all of it, to Hannah Varner directly. Personal email, not company systems. She's had it for days now. She's just been waiting for the right moment to use it. Joshua felt something shift again, another piece sliding into place. She never mentioned that to us. She wouldn't have wanted to move until the timing was right, Donald said. Varner doesn't do anything without being sure of her ground first. But she has it. All of it. Ready whenever you need it. Joshua thanked him and hung up, turning to Nancy with something close to disbelief crossing his face. Varner has had the fraud evidence for days. Donald sent it to her before his access was cut. Nancy sat back slowly, a real smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on her face. So we have the bylaw violation to reverse the dilution and reinstate your chairmanship. And we have Varner sitting on enough documented fraud to end Maison's career the moment she stands up and says so. And Venus's signature is on half of it, Joshua added quietly, whether she read what she was signing or not. Nancy was already reaching for her phone. I'll call Varner now. We need her ready to speak the moment the procedural challenge goes through. This can't be 2 separate fights anymore. It needs to happen in the same room, on the same day, so Maison doesn't have time to regroup between one and the other. Within the hour, Nancy had filed the formal challenge to the bylaw amendment, citing the exact clause and vote count that proved it void. Varner confirmed in a short, steady phone call that she was ready to bring the pension fraud evidence forward publicly the moment the board reconvened. The rescheduled full shareholder meeting was set for 2 days later. the same ballroom where Joshua had first stood at the podium and introduced himself as the company's new majority owner. Joshua stood at the window of Ridgeline's office that evening, looking out over the city, feeling the shape of the ending finally come into focus. Everything they needed had already been there, planted weeks ago, waiting for the right moment. Now all that was left was to use it. 2 days later, the ballroom filled again. The same chandeliers, the same gold light, the same banner still hanging near the front of the room, though it looked smaller now than it had the night of the gala. Shareholders took their seats. Board members filed in along the front row, careful to avoid looking directly at each other. Reporters lined the back wall, notebooks and phones already out, sensing that whatever happened in this room today would be worth far more than another quarter's earnings report. Venus sat near the front beside Maison, her spine straight, her face arranged into something composed, though her hands stayed folded tightly in her lap the entire time. She still believed, as far as anyone could tell, that today was about defending the bylaw amendment. She had no idea what Hannah Varner had been carrying in a locked drawer for the better part of a week. Joshua sat several rows back with Nancy, watching the room settle, saying nothing until the meeting was formally called to order. Hannah Varner stood first. "Before this board addresses any further business," she said, her voice carrying clean and steady across the ballroom, "I move to invalidate the emergency bylaw amendment passed 4 nights ago, on procedural grounds." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Maison straightened in his seat. "The amendment required a 2/3 vote of the full 11-member board," Varner continued. 8 votes. It received 6. She held up a printed copy of the bylaws, the relevant clause highlighted in bright yellow, visible even from the back rows. "This isn't a matter of interpretation. It's arithmetic. The amendment never met the legal threshold to pass, which means it was void the moment it was signed." Nancy rose beside her, presenting the formal legal challenge already filed with the board secretary, walking the room through the vote count line by line. Nobody argued the math. Nobody could. The board secretary confirmed the ruling within minutes. The amendment was invalid. Joshua's ownership stake and his chairmanship were formally reinstated on the spot. Venus's composed expression cracked for the first time, her eyes darting toward Maison, waiting for him to stand, to object, to do something. He didn't move. Joshua rose from his seat and walked to the podium. The same podium from the gala, the same room, the weight of the moment settling over the crowd exactly the way it had the first time he'd stood there. "Thank you, Ms. Varner," he said. Then he turned to face the room fully. "There's one more matter this board needs to address today. One that's far more serious than a miscounted vote." He nodded toward Varner, who lifted a folder from beneath her chair and carried it to the front, handing it directly to the board secretary before turning to address the room herself. "4 days ago," Varner said, "I received documentation from Donald Olivar, this company's senior controller, detailing a pattern of financial fraud spanning at least 4 years. She held up a page, the wire transfers and shell vendor names visible even at a distance. Preston Mason authorized payments through vendor accounts that do not legally exist, routed through the company's pension fund. Skimming from disbursements meant for retired Halstead employees." The room went utterly silent. Somewhere near the back, a reporter's pen scratched furiously against paper. "These authorizations," Varner continued, holding up a second page, "bear Venus Halstead's signature." Whether she understood what she was signing is a separate question, but the paper trail is not in dispute. Venus's face had gone white. She turned toward Maison, her voice barely a whisper. "Preston, tell them this isn't true." Maison said nothing. His jaw worked once, twice, but no words came out, and in that silence, the entire room understood everything it needed to understand. "Mr. Maison," Joshua said from the podium, calm and even. "Would you like to address the board?" Maison stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the floor, and for a moment it looked like he might actually try to speak. Instead, he turned and walked fast toward the exit, his composure finally gone completely. Two security officers, already alerted by Nancy ahead of time, met him at the doors. "Mr. Maison," one of them said, "the board has asked that you remain until this session concludes." The room watched in near total silence as Maison was escorted, not out of the building, but to a private room down the hall to await formal questioning. The same slow, humiliating walk Joshua himself had once made off a plane, except this time surrounded by the very people whose trust he had spent years quietly stealing from. Venus remained frozen beside the podium, alone now. The family name that had always shielded her suddenly meaning nothing at all, in a room full of people who had just watched the truth walk in and take her fixer away in front of everyone. The room didn't settle back into quiet, so much as it shifted into a different kind of tension, sharper now, more focused. With Maison gone from the ballroom, the board reconvened without leaving their seats, the meeting folding directly into the next order of business, as if the whole room understood there was no reason to wait. The board secretary called for order. Joshua remained at the podium, Varner standing just to his side, the folder of evidence now resting on the table in front of the full board for anyone who wanted to examine it directly. "This board has a decision to make," the secretary said, "regarding the removal of Preston Mason from his position as general counsel, and regarding the continued operational role of Venus Halstead as chief executive officer, given the evidence presented." A board member near the end of the table raised a hand. "Do we have confirmation this evidence has been reviewed by outside counsel? I want to be certain we're acting on solid ground before we vote on something this serious." "Confirmed," Nancy said, stepping forward with a stack of files. Independent forensic accountants reviewed the wire transfers and vendor records 2 days ago, ahead of this meeting. Their findings match exactly what's in front of you. 4 years of pension fund disbursements, systematically diverted through shell accounts, all authorized under Mr. Mason's signature. And Ms. Halstead's signature appears on several of these authorizations as well, another board member added, flipping through the folder. Venus sat rigid in her seat, staring straight ahead, no longer trying to defend herself. There was nothing left to say. Everyone in the room had already watched Maison walk out without denying a single word of it. "I'd like to speak," Venus said suddenly, her voice smaller than it had been at any point since the gala. The room quieted. Joshua gave a small nod from the podium, allowing it. Venus stood slowly. "I didn't know," she said. "I want that on the record. I trusted Preston with things I shouldn't have trusted anyone with, without asking enough questions. That's on me. I built my entire career on my father's name and my grandfather's company, and I let a man I trusted handle everything underneath me, while I focused on everything above me. The image, the events, the family legacy." Her voice cracked slightly. "That doesn't make me innocent. I understand that. But I want it said that I didn't know." Joshua looked at her for a long moment, the same steady, unreadable look he'd given her on the plane. "Not knowing isn't the same as innocent, Ms. Halstead," he said. "You signed what you didn't read. And whether you knew about the pension fraud or not, you knew exactly what you were doing when you had me removed from that flight, and exactly what you were doing when you took a story to the press that you had every reason to know wasn't true." Venus had nothing left to offer against that. She sat back down slowly, her hands folded once more in her lap, all the fight finally drained out of her. The board called the vote. It passed without a single dissent, unanimous removal of Preston Mason from his position and from any future role with the company, along with a formal referral of the fraud findings to outside legal authorities. The board followed immediately with a second vote, equally unanimous, removing Venus Halstead from her position as Chief Executive Officer, citing gross negligence in her oversight responsibilities. Joshua's chairmanship, along with his full 51% ownership stake, was confirmed and reaffirmed on the record, unquestioned and unchallenged. The board secretary read the final tally aloud, and the room broke into scattered applause, quiet at first, then building as shareholders around the room began to understand exactly what they'd just witnessed: a company finally, publicly, holding its own leadership accountable instead of quietly protecting them. Hannah Varner stepped forward and shook Joshua's hand in front of the room, a small, satisfied nod passing between them. Donald Olivar, standing near the side of the ballroom where he'd slipped in quietly during Varner's testimony, allowed himself a rare, tired smile. Venus rose from her seat without a word, gathering her things with as much dignity as she could manage, the eyes of the entire room following her toward the exit. Nobody stopped her. Nobody needed to. She had built her whole life around a name that had always opened doors for her without question. Today, for the first time, that name meant nothing at all. The applause faded slowly, shareholders rising from their seats, the low murmur of conversation filling the ballroom as people began gathering coats and bags, already reaching for their phones to share what they'd just witnessed. Joshua remained at the podium a moment longer, watching the room shift back into motion. He caught Nancy's eye across the space, and she gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "This part's yours." He tapped the microphone once, and the room quieted again, curious what more there could possibly be to say after everything that had just happened. "Before everyone leaves," Joshua said, "I want to say a few things." He found Hannah Varner standing near the front row and looked at her directly. "Ms. Varner, you sat on this board for years being handed decisions instead of being asked for your judgment. You didn't have to fight for the truth today. You could have stayed quiet, protected your position, waited to see which way the wind blew before you said anything. You didn't. This company is better for it." Varner inclined her head slightly, something close to pride crossing her usually guarded expression. Joshua's eyes moved next to Donald, standing near the side of the room, still looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention. "And Mr. Olivar, you had every reason to stay quiet, too. You could have kept your head down, done your job, let someone else eventually notice what Maison was doing. Instead, you spent a year uneasy about numbers nobody asked you to question. And when it mattered, you did something about it, even when it put you at risk." Joshua paused. "The people whose pensions were protected because of what you found will never know your name. But I know it. This company knows it now, too." A few scattered claps rose again around the room, warmer this time, more personal. "Going forward," Joshua continued, "this company is going to operate differently. Full transparency with the board on all financial matters. An independent audit every year, no exceptions, no one person's signature carrying more weight than the numbers behind it. I didn't take 51% of this company to run it exactly the way it's been run. I took it because I believed it could be run better, and today proved exactly why that matters." He let that settle, then looked out across the room one last time, his eyes finally landing on Venus, who had stopped near the back doors, unable to leave without hearing whatever he had left to say. The room seemed to hold its breath. Joshua didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "A little over a week ago," he said, "I sat down in seat 2A on a flight to this city. I had a valid ticket. I hadn't said a word to anyone. And a woman decided, without checking, without asking, without a single second of doubt, that I didn't belong there." He paused. She had me removed in front of a plane full of strangers because she couldn't imagine a man like me had earned that seat honestly. Venus stood frozen near the doors, every eye in the ballroom now following Joshua's gaze toward her. I told her that day she'd want to remember that seat, Joshua said. I don't think she understood what I meant at the time. I'm not sure she fully understands it now. But I think everyone in this room does. He stepped back from the microphone, the moment complete. Nothing left to add. Venus held his gaze for one long second. Not defiant anymore, not composed. Just small in a way she had never once allowed herself to be in public before. Then she turned and walked out through the ballroom doors, alone, the sound of her heels against the marble, the only noise left in a room that had gone completely silent, watching her go. Joshua stepped down from the podium as conversation slowly rebuilt around him, shareholders reaching to shake his hand, reporters calling out questions he'd answer another day. Nancy met him halfway across the room, a genuine, exhausted smile finally breaking across her face. "You didn't gloat," she said. "I half expected you to." "Didn't need to," Joshua said, glancing once more toward the doors Venus had disappeared through. She already knows exactly what she lost. Outside, the evening light was fading over the city, the same city that had watched a man get thrown off a plane for sitting in a seat he'd rightfully earned, and had now watched him stand at the front of the very company that seat had ultimately led him to. He hadn't needed to raise his voice once. The truth had done all the work. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.